Yes. So this afternoon, I want to do two separate things. One of them is to show you some work that I'm currently doing, and then to present the paper which has been advertised called Skill, Intelligence, Embodiment, What Does It Mean to Learn, or words to that effect. So I thought I'd begin by showing you an AI project that I've been working on with some computer science students at my university in California. This is kind of my response to the new AI and the kind of rhetoric of creativity and other silliness that's going on. So I decided that I would build a digital simulation of myself, who is called Professor Sim Simon. And the project sometimes goes by the name, by the title, Portrait of the Artist as a Professor. And so what we've done is well, you'll see what we've done, but we've basically trained the LLM on the last 20 years of my professional writing and then have it make presentations that I've never made. So I'm going to show you a lecture by Professor Sim Simon. I've never written these words. I've never spoken these words. So we'll just look at a couple of these. Start with this one.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of a pressing issue at the intersection of technology and education.
Can everyone online
Today
here?
We'll delve into the integration of AI into university education, ethical use, and challenges. As we embark on this journey, I want to highlight the dual nature of technological advancement, particularly with AI. On one hand, AI offers profound opportunities for cognitive enhancement and the democratization of knowledge. It has the potential to transform how we learn, teach, and interact with information. On the other hand, it poses risks that could undermine authentic learning experiences and erode the integrity of our educational institutions. This dichotomy raises critical questions. How can we harness AI to foster deeper engagement and enrich the learning process? Conversely, how might AI inadvertently commodify cognitive labor, reducing education to mere transactions devoid of genuine intellectual effort? Throughout this presentation, we'll examine these questions, seeking a balanced perspective on integrating AI ethically and productively in university settings. To begin, let's examine how AI, particularly large language models like GPT-4, is transforming education. These AI systems are now capable of performing tasks once thought exclusive to humans. They can generate complex, coherent text, assist with research, and provide real-time tutoring. The potential for ethical and...
So I'll stop that there, and you can find these videos on my website, simonpenny.net. I think that a couple of things I quickly just want to say about this is that, you know, it's interesting because it's boring. And it kind of amused me to essentially attempt to get the LLM to critique the questionable uses of LLMs in educational contexts. So we're continuing with developing these short lectures, and it's important to note that obviously that was a voice clone, a deep fake video, and the slides have already also been prepared by a combination of AI tools, with as little hands-on as possible from me and the team. I'll show you now another one that, can we have sound again, John, for a minute? Sorry about that. And I'll mute my, okay, good to go?
首先 AI 工具的应用无疑赋予了学生更多的能力。我们可以设想一个学生在面对一篇复杂的学术文献时，借着 GPT 等自然语言处理工具，可以快速生成摘要并提炼关键观点。这种高效的学习方式确实能够帮助。
That is, of course, Professor Sim Simon speaking in Chinese, and we'll be producing a set of online lectures. Several of my team members are Chinese, and so I trust them to judge the quality of the translation. And one of them said that it was particularly interesting because not only was the Chinese translation decent, but also it was speaking Chinese not as a native speaker, but as someone with an Australian accent who had perhaps been learning Chinese for several years. So I thought that was pretty special. Yeah. Anyway, that's just to introduce some of these projects that I've been working on. Now, we are going to go and find the slides for the talk, the advertised talk. Today, I want to sketch out a neurophysiologically based refutation of the skill-intelligence binary and explore the implications for understanding how we learn and how we know. Most of us enjoy specialized embodied practices. We play musical instruments, sports, martial arts, yoga, artisanal crafts, or pastry making. In doing these, we experience a kind of immersed intelligent action in the world that is sensorimotorically multimodal, improvisatory, and thoroughly integrated with a skilled use of tools, materials, artifacts, structured spaces, and other people that, at the best of times, functions as a cognitive ecology. In such contexts, thinking as reasoning or problem solving or applying facts recedes, and a different kind of being in the world takes over. My neurophysiologically holistic premise is that there is something fundamentally wrong with the conception that knowledge or intelligence is resident in one part of the body, the rest being sensors and end effectors. This centralized computational analogy is, in my opinion, not particularly explanatory. The brain computer controlling the meat robot never made experiential sense to me. So I'm seeking a distributed, networked, ecological understanding of human neurophysiology that to some extent decenters the brain. I prefer to think of the brain as numerous separate organs, each integrated into larger bodily systems. In this view, a key function of the brain becomes multimodal sensorimotor connection and integration. If my argument is valid, there's no principled distinction between intelligence and skill. And intelligence or skill is of the whole organism, integrated by tight feedback loops in the specificities of particular material and social contexts. Intelligence can no longer be regarded as being exclusively of or existing in some space of mental abstractions. To the extent that computational discourses are premised upon the separation of information and matter, that is software and hardware, exposing the Cartesian roots of the enterprise shows that exposing the Cartesian roots of the enterprise provides an insurmountable counter-argument to the rhetorics of AI. Sorry about that. Seem to have got my slides out of order here. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about, there we go. I'm going to talk about that, knowing how and knowing that. Gilbert Ryle made a distinction between know how and know that map onto the skill intelligence binary. Know that is, loosely speaking, book learning. Learning via linguistic and quasi-linguistic symbolic media, text, numbers, and so on. It is plainly obvious that many things we learn and do cannot be expressed in linguistic symbolic form. How to knead bread, how to get your foot up to the next hold on the climbing wall, whether the branch will hold your weight. Ryle's distinction between know-how and know that is a useful way to distinguish these two kinds of knowing, as is Andy Pickering's distinction between the performative idiom and the representational idiom. But we have to be careful when we adopt these kind of analytic distinctions. It's another binary distinction, know how, know that. And we ought to be careful not simply to replace a new set of binaries with the old set of binaries. And as I've been thinking about knowing how, knowing that, it becomes clear that what's most interesting is the way these things slide into each other and create each other and inform each other. Contemporary educational styles at all levels valorize abstract symbolic knowledge, book learning, and devalorize embodied knowledge. In modern educational systems at all levels, the value of performative learning, learning by doing, has diminished, though progressive contemporary theory emphasizes experiential hands-on learning. Many art, craft, design, and performing arts schools, along with some architectural schools and others, have fought for the importance of know-how, right, with varying success and with varying levels of support. Administrators and academics with little familiarity with the performative making practices are inclined to see such protestations as quaint. As a result, materially engaged performative practices, be they in the arts, in labs or workshops or in field work, have to be justified in these institutions in representational academic terms. At least that's the way it is in the circles that I move in, and it may be much more enlightened here. I'll be interested to talk to you about that. But traditions of skill teaching and skill learning have existed for millennia, largely outside of or prior to academic institutions, and they're often described as apprenticeships. The idea of the apprenticeship fell out of favor in educational circles in the 20th century, whether influenced by progressive educational theory or under pressure of neoliberal economies. Streamlining the curriculum in teach-to-the-text modalities, more recently embracing digital environments that enforce paradigms of rote learning and regurgitation with a concomitant reduction in hands-on experiences. So I'm now moving to a section called philosophical baggage, and in order to develop a deeper comprehension of skill as cognition, I want to point out now that my quarry here is to destabilize the skill-intelligence binary, and I'll cover that in this section, and also try to think about what that means for teaching skills. That's essentially the project here today. In order to develop a deeper comprehension of skill as cognition, one must begin with a denaturalization of entrenched values. Central to this enterprise is a recognition that conventional philosophical formulations of our lived being as being divided into two parts, an immaterial thinking part and a material doing part, the Cartesian mind-body dualism. This is the concept that first has to be destabilized. Now, Descartes first postulated what we call a substance dualism, that there are actual separate things. There's an immaterial thinking bit and a material doing bit, the res cogitans and the res extensa. Few people are substance dualists these days, at least in academic environments, but property dualism persists, and property dualism says all of these things happen within the same kind of matter, but there are these kind of abstract theoretical immaterial parts and these instantiated embodied parts. So thinking and doing are different properties, often assigned to brain and body. But in my opinion, that's not much of an improvement. One kind of tissue does the thinking and another kind of tissue does the working. And this formulation stands in the way, I think, of getting a more coherent understanding of skilled practices. Is the conventional distinction between skill and intelligence principled and explanatorily useful, or is it a redundant philosophical construct? So the problem with this construction is that it carves out the realm of skill and the realm of intelligence into different territories, which I think is very problematic. So it's important to dismantle the skill intelligence binary because it's illusory, right? And because abandoning it will permit us to comprehend cognition and intelligence better as integrated into bodily capacities and experience. In almost every case, when one establishes a kind of analytic binary, it permits one to think in certain ways and also excludes thinking in other ways, builds kind of structures that are not necessarily pertinent to the topic of inquiry. So reading philosophy of mind, conventional philosophy of mind, one could be excused for thinking that the brain grew a body. The opposite, of course, is the case. The successful getting by in the world that we call skill is therefore what intelligence is for. If bodies grew brains to facilitate success in the world, then skill is the central purpose and realization of intelligence, and not some inconvenient but pragmatically ancillary process that's ancillary to the main functions of the brain. So what I want to propose here is, I think, in some circles, somewhat radical, that because we have brains to be successful in the world, it's actually embodied, engaged practices in the world that are the purpose of having a brain. And those other sorts of things that we think are very wonderful, like language and mathematics and music and so on, are in some sense epiphenomena. So this is what I mean about not only decentering the brain, but also rebalancing the equation, where we don't denigrate embodied practices as being somehow undesirable because they engage with materiality. Because as a culture, and certainly in academic cultures, we valorize abstraction, which I think, is something that needs to be checked. So by this logic, adepts in dance, bricklayers, gardeners, and artisans and performers of all kind exhibit the epitome of intelligence, and the decorations of the mental, language, music, logic, mathematics, are epiphenomena. Skilled action in the world is what the brain is primarily for. The idea of the mind and the status accorded to it is one of the central motifs in Enlightenment humanist philosophy. This is a symptom of the way that the person in philosophy is again carved into doing and thinking parts. But the concept of mind is not exactly straightforward, as Richard Rorty has discussed in his book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. Our so-called intuition about what is mental may be merely our readiness to fall in with a specifically philosophical language game. It's using Wittgensteinian terminology there, but basically the argument is that some of these concepts we throw around that we've inherited from philosophy of mind are so hazy as to essentially be not very useful. So if we can dissolve the skill intelligence binary and dissolve the mind-body binary, then certain kinds of questions like, is it mental or is it physical, become nonsensical. And so I hope that we can address the matter of skill without being hobbled by those kind of artificial philosophical constructions. For instance, the traditional explanations for the question, where do the concepts we think with come from, has a magical or mystical dimension to it if you accept a kind of mentalist notion of the Platonic ideals, that somehow there is this immaterial realm of concepts that somehow flow into the immaterial mind. Of course, Vittorio Galezi and George Lakoff have argued that the concepts that we work with largely come from embodied experience, and I would concur with that. Now, one of the dimensions of this that is particularly pertinent to us as artists and designers is this notion that Tim Ingold calls hylomorphism. And hylomorphism is the term that Ingold uses. Some people say he uses it incorrectly, from Aristotle, but he takes it to mean the idea that every creative act is preceded by a creative thought necessarily. So this falls into line with the kind of computational notion of planning, or coding, and then implementation in action or in materiality. But philosophers, and some philosophers have also rejected this idea, right? So Gilbert Ryle said, when I do something intelligently, i.e. thinking what I'm doing one thing and not two. My performance has a special procedure or manner, not special antecedents. And antecedents is the key word there, right? So, and other people who have sort of theorized bricolage and improvisation will also argue that the idea that we have to necessarily preconceive a creative idea in order to have a creative act is completely unnecessary, right? So if we can dispense with the concept of mind, which I'm keen to do, then the distinction between skill and intelligence is far less clear and things get more interesting. Sorry. So this work has brought me to a position where I'm forced to critique and deconstruct a whole range of this terminology that we commonly use. You know, words like consciousness, mind, mental representation are all, in my opinion, up for grabs. The problem with using these terms is that when you use them in a circle like this, you know, and say, oh, you know, something is conscious or non-conscious, everyone goes, yeah, I know what you mean. No, and we don't know what we mean because we all think something different, right? I mean, if I asked us all right now to write 100 words on the definition of mind, we might get entirely different sorts of responses. So I try to be skeptical. I'm uncomfortable with the whole notion of mind, and I try to avoid it. I'm uncomfortable with the conscious-unconscious distinction because I think, although it's quite clear we have a sense that we can be conscious or non-conscious, and exactly what those terms mean is unclear. So I'm calling for more precision, right? I'm skeptical about what we call higher cognition and lower cognition. I think contemporary neuroscience is increasingly showing us that the things that we've understood as being more abstract and you know are often buried deep in motor routines in ways that make no sense according to a kind of conventional faculty psychology model. The question of mental representation is, again, very problematic unless we get very precise about what we're talking about. Now, that's not to say that I reject this terminology, but I'm calling for precision. I'm also, and while I engage contemporary neuroscience, I'm also conscious that scientific experiment in general is, you know, according to the conventional model, built around hypotheses, and hypotheses are premised on axiomatic assumptions and disciplinary kind of frameworks. So sometimes I see when I'm reading neuroscience that the kind of questions that are being asked are informed by a kind of underlying set of philosophical premises that in some cases, I suspect some of the experimenters are not always aware of. So I want to talk about something, I want to talk about phylogenetic neuroscience as a way for justifying this neurophysiological holism. So the evolutionary history of neural tissue refutes many of the conventional philosophical notions that we see in the philosophy of mind, right? The a neurobiological perspective on the brain is that its first and primary function is the coordination of systems, sensory systems, motor systems via multiple networks, endocrine, immune, neural, vasovagal, and others, right? A coherent conception of the cognitive qualities of skill must, in my assessment, begin by approaching skill and cognition and intelligence as whole organism phenomena. Developmental and evolutionary arguments support an understanding that the cognitive capabilities of the person are capabilities of the organism as a whole. And these forms and capabilities are results of evolution. They further the organism's ability to get by in the world. The earliest neural tissue emerged to facilitate the fundamental metabolic functions of digestion and excretion. When animals became more mobile, a primary function of neural tissue was the coordination of movement. As animals began to move faster, overcoming the inertia of their medium, the need to sense at a distance brought forth new sensory neurology integrated with motor neural functions. Brains exist to facilitate mobile organisms as they make their way in the world. Their worlds, we have to remember, are isomorphic with their sensory and sensorimotor capacities, as Jakob von Uexküll showed. That means, in case you're unfamiliar with von Uexküll's notion of the Umwelt, that the kind of world that we have as an organism is given to us by the kinds of sensory capabilities we have as an organism. So the kind of world, the kind of sensory or sensorimotor world that we have is a product of the kinds of sensory capabilities that we have. So our worlds are specific to our particular neurosensorimotor construction. So Schaffer et al. Say brains evolved to coordinate bodily systems in an efficient manner, providing uninterrupted energy regulation in an ever-changing but only partly predictable world. Brains did not evolve to think, feel, see, and so on. They created these events as they perform a dynamic and complex budgeting process that continues from birth till death. Some of you might know the story of the tunicate, which is a marine organism. It's like a barnacle. And the marine, it looks like a shellfish or something, but in fact, it's a chordate, and its larval form is mobile. It has a primitive spinal cord and some sensing capabilities, and it swims around until it finds a place to plant itself, where it will spend the rest of its adult life as a sedentary organism. And when it finds that place to perch itself for the rest of its life, the first thing it does is it eats its own brain, because it doesn't need it anymore. It's metabolically not useful. Now, the developmental aspect of this argument is that each of us grew from a single cell. We are fundamentally and inherently biologically integrated. Every cell in our body is made of the same stuff, roughly the same set of molecules and the same structures. So this is a developmental argument for trying to think of the organism as a whole, rather than imposing a kind of artificial separation between brain and body. So what I'm arguing for is that all these functions that we sometimes call skill and sometimes intelligence and sometimes whatever, awareness or so, that we presume to be located in the cranium are physiologically networked and distributed and dynamic. And I'm becoming increasingly radical about this. I'm saying that it's quite possible that knowledge and awareness and memory are physiologically distributed. I'm not going to assign them to the cranium until it's established that they're not infused through the rest of the body. So Kelso and Tula said in 1984, if there's a lesson to be learned from the field of neuroembryology, it's that motility precedes reactivity. There is a chronological primacy of motor over the sensory, and any distinction between sensory and motor is an artificial one. So this is another angle on the cracking up of this kind of linear sense, cogitate, act, that's such a copy of the von Neumann processor model of consciousness, right? Input, processing, output, sensing, cognition, action. The inactive cognition theorists will, of course, say that's nonsense, that we sense in order to act, and so on. Cognition is a property of the whole organism. As Francisco Varela put it, the mind cannot be separated from the entire organism. The organism, as a meshwork of entirely co-determining elements, makes it so that our minds are literally inseparable, not only from the external environment, but from what Claude Bernard already called the milieu intérieur, the fact that we have not only a brain, but an entire body. This, if we really embrace these kinds of attitudes, this reconfigures conceptions of knowledge, selfhood, awareness, and capability. And such holism is fundamentally incompatible with reductionist experimental procedures. This has been a dilemma in the philosophy of science since the emergence of dynamical systems theory. Complexity and emergence became topical in the late 80s and early 90s. And as I said, the inactivists insist on the concept of the sensorimotor, that there's no sensing without action, there's no action without sensing, you can't separate sensing and action. That's just an arbitrary analytic construction that doesn't actually pertain to the body in question. So we've talked briefly about the kind of evolutionary period. Now I want to talk about something I call paleocognition, which has to do with primates and hominids, and what that's got to do with embodied cognition and notions of skill. So the dates for the oldest Homo sapiens keeps being pushed back. When I was a kid, it was 30,000 years. Now it's 200,000 years. The first bipedal hominins appeared between 6 and 7 million years ago. Increasingly, bipedal hominins developed in ways that enhanced their survival, growing more dexterous hands, bigger brains, more specialized eyes, and all manner of more subtle qualities and capabilities, including tool use. The oldest stone tool that we found now is 3.3 million years old. That's a very long time. So to the extent that we have a kind of lineage of bipedalism, the qualities that we now have been formed over a long evolutionary process. If cognitive capabilities are based in biology, we must assume that the way we cognize is a result, at least in part, of hominin and primate evolution over millions of years. It follows that the kinds of sensorimotor and neurocognitive qualities we possess are adaptations to a pre-agricultural, let alone pre-industrial lifestyles, right? So the things that we can do are essentially adapted to roughly pre-technological hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyles. They're the things we're good at. right? And whatever we do now is repurposing of some of those capabilities that have been conferred upon our species by millions of years of evolution, because the evolutionary period, even since the beginning of agriculture, is in evolutionary time a blip. It's it's an insignificant evolutionary time. So what's terribly important about us is this. We've got dexterous hands and we have stereoscopic vision that, interestingly enough, is stereoscopic exactly in the areas that we can reach with our hands. Beyond that, stereoscopy ceases to be particularly useful. We get our depth cues from other things such as occlusion. So this peripersonal sensorimotor space is what confers on us our extraordinary capabilities, cognitive and material, I would say. So I'm going to talk about proprioception now. The sense, as I say, that makes the other senses make sense. Now, Western philosophy speaks of 5 senses, right? They all happen to be outward-looking senses. They're stuck on the face, on the body in ways that you can poke with your finger, right? They're obvious. It's kind of fascinating to me then that pretty much the entire history of Western philosophy before the late 19th century did not celebrate or even note the existence of the internal body sense that we have, that we call proprioception, that, I argue, calibrates and scaffolds all the other senses. We could not have effective vision without our proprioception. Piaget showed this. As infants, we calibrate our vision through bodily movement, right? That's how we build an image of the world. And there's a classic experiment by Hein and Held, the kittens in the baskets experiment, that established this as well. So William James really, I think, was one of the people who early on pointed out the importance of this internal body sense. Our own bodily position, attitude, and condition is one of the things of which some awareness, however inattentive, invariably accompanies the knowledge of whatever else we know. So he's saying, he's not using the word proprioception, but he's saying that this sense of how we are in space that's conferred upon us by this internal bodily sense accompanies every other experience we have, right? And structures it and informs it. So proprioception is, loosely speaking, the awareness of the state of parts of our body in relation to each other, the forces that are acting on them. It's the sense that tells us what shape our body's in when we're doing things like this, you know. And what's interesting, of course, it's internal and self-referential. There are apparently 4 different kinds of nerve endings that are the afferent and efferent end effectors of proprioception, and they reside mostly in the muscles, also in the joints. You've got about 2.5 million of them. Divided by the number of muscles you have in the body, that's about 40,000 nerve endings per muscle. That seems a staggering amount of neurological information that most philosophy of mind and theories of cognition have just kind of ignored, right? 40,000 nerve endings per muscle. That's more than is in the skin, including all the sensitive bits. So we walk about, we swim, we climb ladders, we write with a pen or pencil. And this all involves not just motor routines, but sensitive real-time adjustment, right? Which is all going on in a high-speed feedback loops between the nerve endings in the muscles and what we call spinal motor pools, which are mostly located in the spine. So, you know, when we do something like we're walking, right? We're walking on a hard road, and we step up a curb, and then we step onto grass, and we step down a curb, and then we step onto sand, and the feel of the sand is completely different from the feel of the grass or the concrete that was before. Most of this happens unconsciously. You can be chatting away to your friend and, you know, just vaguely noticing that there's a curb there. You know, you step on the sand. It's like, oh, yeah. All of that real-time attunement is what the auto-calibration of proprioception is doing. So it's a incredibly lively, a constantly lively sort of sensing. And, you know, as interestingly Descartes said, the skill of a lute player is partly in the muscles of his hands. And this brings me to the next, concluding parts of the paper, which is how does all this now pertain to how we think about skill learning and skill teaching, as opposed to the learning of facts, book learning. As a sculptor, I've always taught skill, but it's a mysterious process, right? And it also asks the questions that even Descartes felt persuaded by, that some of the knowledge that we have, some of the awareness that we have, some of the memory that we have, if you like, is distributed throughout the body, right? It's kind of a wonderful quote to have, because, of course, I've also often demonized Descartes, but he was very clear on this fact. So, how do we learn skills? From a neurological perspective, a neurophysiological perspective, I think these things are important. Perhaps it's not an authoritative list, but we build muscular capability. Let's just say we're talking about motor skills, you know, using a hammer or whatever it happens to be. But more importantly, we build neural pathways to control and monitor. And so it's not just about building muscles, it's about building neural networks. We also, of course, integrate different sensory modalities. You know, I was talking to a guy the other day who's learning to play trumpet, you know, and it's like, well, your face is doing this kind of thing and your lungs are doing this kind of thing, and you're hearing the noise that you're making and you're going, well, that's grotesque. It doesn't sound like I want it to sound like, but you have some idea of what it should sound like. So you adjust things in different ways and approximate the kind of sound you think you're. So there's this interesting area of goal setting that I'm still thinking about. But so there's this integration of sensorimotor modalities, right? Vision, hearing, action, touch, proprioception. And then there's the development of relationships with artifacts and objects in the world, right? Because almost invariably, the kind of skill I'm talking about involves tools and materials, whether it's a pencil or a welding torch or whatever it happens to be. And that's fascinating, right? Because let's just say, you know, we pick up the pen and maybe it's a big pen and I'm using it at the end of my hand like this. Instantaneously, my sense of myself has embraced the pen to the drawing tip. I'm not trying to jam my fist into the whiteboard. you know, and it's more clear when you talk about something like a sledgehammer, right? It's like suddenly I've incorporated the dimensions and the momentum and the mass of this thing into my body model, right? And then just as quickly, I can drop that thing and my sense of self is no longer extended out into that inanimate object. And then I pick up a pair of scissors and my body extension and the way that my proprioception and motor control wraps itself around that tool is completely new. And then just as quickly, it's like a bursting of a balloon or something. It's gone again, right? When I put that tool down. That's amazing, right? I mean, that is truly astonishing, I think. So one of the things that's become clear to me is that, and I think we all know this, right? We play musical instruments or we use certain refined tools, and it's like a really good violin in the hands of a novice is useless. A cheap violin in the hands of a virtuoso is also doesn't give optimal performance, right? So there's this kind of complementarity of sophistication of tool and sophistication of skill. They're sort of isomorphic and mirror each other. So we continue to, as we develop more refined skills, we develop more refined tools that then help us develop more refined skills, and so on. I just said that. I just said that. So quickly, I talk about a couple of different ways in which certain kinds of neurophysiological research is supporting this general push, right? So this section is called Mirror Neurons, the Dorsal Pathway, and Kidney Knowledge. And you may know about some of this stuff, but I'll just run through a couple of points here. So first of all, you probably know about blindsight. The human visual system has two separate pathways. The so-called dorsal pathway has been more recently discovered and celebrated. So the ventral pathway, it's called the ventral pathway, is kind of the know-that pathway. It appears to be concerned with pattern identification, naming things. No, that's an apple, that's a dog. The dorsal pathway seems to be in tight connection with motor circuitry. And you can have a completely damaged ventral pathway, you can be clinically blind, and yet when someone throws a basketball at you, you'll dodge it, right? So there's it's also a kind of, a conscious and unconscious visual pathway. So there's something going on with a non-linguistic connection between visual and motor functionality. Turns out that's also going on between other sensory modalities and motor functions. Ross and Subramaniam recently published a paper in which they have identified that when listening to music, the understanding of rhythm is actually happening in motor aspects of the brain, not in the auditory areas. So once again, contemporary neuroscience is twisting and bending our ideas of what should go with what in the brain. And we have to be very careful not to impose old ideas on our understanding of what experience and cognition really are and where those things are located and how they're connected. You probably also know about the idea of mirror neurons, Rizzolatti, and so on, right? When the baby monkey sees the mother monkey peeling a banana, the muscles, the motor muscles in the baby fire, the right muscles. So there's a kind of completely non-linguistic connection between visual perception through presumably that dorsal pathway to motor action. That's learning, that's non-symbolic, non-linguistic, right? So those are interesting examples that lead us to think that there's something about teaching skills which is different from teaching that kind of knowledge. Recently, there's some new research that's just come out about memory in the kidneys in not only non-brain tissue, but not even neural tissue. It's actually in cellular material. And Steve was telling me earlier this morning, and of course it reminded me that of course that kind of memory is known all over the body. The immune system has memory of its own. So, you know, the question, once again, we're talking about mental representation, we're talking about memory. The idea that these things are necessarily located in the brain is a question. We need to be more precise about what sort of memory we're talking about. So you probably have seen the famous Penfield's homunculus images, this image drawn onto the brain of this figure with a big tongue and a big nose and big hands and moderately sized genitals and tiny chest and slightly big feet, right? So that work was recently repeated by Gordon Dosenbach and others. And they found that this representation of the mapping on the brain is in fact inaccurate. That it's not one sort of continuous band mapping the whole body over this particular wrinkle in the brain, but in fact there are centers separated by areas that manage interconnection between different areas of the brain. And that's an interesting observation because, or that's an interesting finding because it reinforces an idea that I mentioned earlier in the paper, which is one of the primary jobs of the brain is multimodal interconnection and correlation. It's like, well, you know, the hand is doing that, but I want to know which direction the hand is moving in relation to the mass of my body in a kind of place and grid cell kind of sense, right? So there's a lot of this sort of motor intermodal correlation is that we haven't really thought about as being a major part of work that the brain does. It may in fact transpire to be that it is. So let's talk briefly about teaching skills and then we'll be done. So what does all this mean for teaching skills? How does skill pedagogy work? How do you teach your child to ride a bicycle? Apparently, you can't achieve know-how by instruction. So conventionally, we understand pedagogy by, you know, using this term instruction. But know-how, if it's proprioceptive, at least in large part, and sensorimotorically integrated, it's internal. It's a kind of internal bodily knowing. So how do you teach that? I was talking to a Japanese trained wooden boat builder, Douglas Brooks. He says of his workshops, there's absolutely no speaking in the workshop. Students learn by observation. And that's kind of interesting because that's not the sort of thing we do, right? He says students are used to education as externalities, a professor or an expert telling them the facts from a lectern, then expecting them to creatively regurgitate the facts back to them. But that's not the case for skill learning. Now, a few years ago, David Sudnow published a book called The Ways of the Hand. He's a cognitive scientist, and he wrote a book about learning jazz piano. And he used to talk about how his teacher would use these kind of verbal instructions that really had no meaning, that had no kind of semantic meaning, but somehow nudged the student in a certain direction. One of these terms he used was jazz hands. What does jazz hands mean? I don't know. So that's kind of interesting, because it prompts one to ask, what's the role of language in a kind of pedagogy where know that is not operative? So I'll just finish on this. I'm thinking that skill teaching is a matter of well-chosen nudges. The task of a teacher is to bring the student to a situation where, in attempting to enact the described or demonstrated action, they come to comprehend what it might be, that's a typo, to inhabit that mode of action. And once that possibility is comprehended, the student can proceed in a self-directed way. So because skill learning is fundamentally internal, it has to be. It's like, so that's it. I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Online audience and in-person audience.